this afternoon and I know are making their way back. And as Mary reminded us this morning, it's very timely that we're having these discussions in the context of the much broader movement that's happening. I was looking at some of the Twitter comments over lunch, and there are estimates that today, in over 951 cities across 82 countries, that these protests are happening. So maybe what we're seeing is the beginning of a coalescing around some of the debates that organisations like TASC have been involved in for a long number of years, but how that's feeding into broader movements. Many of us, I think, would say that was fairly predictable, or we would have hoped that it was fairly predictable that we would start to see these kind of responses. And indeed, I was reading an analysis by Citibank back in 2005, just this week, which did predict it in the context of how best the wealthy could take advantage of inequalities in wealth, the realities that 1% hold 42% of the wealth in the United States, and what that meant for generating more wealth. And they did acknowledge at the end of that paper that perhaps inevitably at some point in the future we were going to see some kind of social unrest and response to this. So I think the theme of this afternoon's discussion around inequality and a more equal future is a particularly important one. I'm not going to say anything else because we are, as I said, tight on time, so I'm going to hand the floor straight over to Tom Healy, who is Director of the Economic Research Unit, and he's also going to tell us a little bit more about what the Economic Research Unit is. Tom, just to warn you, I've downloaded a bell on my iPhone. I'm not afraid to use it. I hope that I don't have to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon. The A in TASC stands for action, so it's nice to link think tanks with action for social change. I just want to say a few brief things about the Economic Research Unit because it will not be familiar to most of you, or perhaps to all of you. I've just joined this unit 2 weeks ago, and it has been established, sponsored and funded by 23 trade unions so far, all of them affiliated to the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. We are independent of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, but we're not neutral. We're all economists, and please don't hold that against us. We're attempting to develop an alternative analysis and series of policy options on both parts of the island. We have a presence in Belfast as well as Dublin, and I really look forward to working with TASC, with all of the team there, and indeed any other progressive or research body for which there is obviously common interest and common ground. Recently I was talking to a young woman who was just about to leave for another country. She had graduated in teacher training and was about to leave her family, her friends, to join her classmates abroad. She delayed by a month because she had a duty to her camogie club, her local camogie club. And we were talking about the current situation, and I just made a note of some of the things she said, but this is the way things are. We just have to accept it. We can't do anything about it. And I think a lot of people feel that way, even broadly amongst those of us who would support a more egalitarian, a more left-of-centre political position, if you wanted to use that term. There is a wide sense, yes, it isn't fair, and there is a fairer, better way, but what can you do? We are in receivership, as someone told us recently. And there is the Troika. The Troika, of course, is now a very ominous term. And one of the things I think that we need to look at again is to what extent are there options and choices, because one of the things I want to suggest is that actually we need to look again at domestic political economy, because a lot of the choices and a lot of the options have been driven much more by domestic policy. And I would include in that bracket such issues as the national minimum wage. They didn't make us do it. And I would also include issues like the fact that we are and will be a low-tax and low-spend economy. In fairness to the European Commission, they would like to see us raising more taxes on things like corporations, for example, And I suspect that most of our colleagues in the European Union would prefer to see Ireland closer to European norms of taxation and expenditure. But the way that we have chosen to rectify our deficit and put our public finances in order was our choice, and that's what we offered the Troika last November. And I'll develop that point in a second. This is an overview of the current political economic situation. It's a challenge. Just to reflect for a moment on what's been happening over the last 2 years, we've had an extraordinary development, really, insofar as all the significant banks, apart maybe from the Bank of Ireland, and finance houses have been taken into public ownership. We've had nationalisation across the board, more than the good assets. We've had the bad assets all lumped together, taken into public ownership. I think we used to call this the commanding heights of the economy, if I remember, a few years ago. And not only that, but golf courses and apartments and fields and shopping centres and all sorts of things effectively have come under public ownership and control. So we have many lame ducks needing lots of feed and recapitalisation in the case of the banks. And we have other ducks that are not so lame and that are waiting to be fattened up, to be sold off. So it is a topsy-turvy world. In fact, quite literally, capitalism was saved by socialism, except it was socialism not for us, but for the 1% who have been bailed out. In that regard, it's interesting because I've been at a number of meetings over the last week or two, and including a briefing on the budget in the ESRI. As we speak, the Dublin Economics Workshop is taking place in Kenmare. Mr. Chopra is speaking there actually at 6:30. And I know from previous conferences there that the RT cameras, there's a siege in Kenmare. All the satellite dishes are out, and the camera people are wandering around the audience, and if economist Peter Connell there, or Terence, or whoever stands up, the camera is straight in, and this is high time economists speaking to the nation, imparting their wisdom. I don't know about you, but I'm a little bit sick of this, actually. And maybe a meditation for the day would suitably be taken from the Gospel of St. Luke. Alas, alas for you lawyers, because you load on men burdens that are unendurable, burdens that you yourselves do not move a finger to lift. And I wonder what economist or commentator or researcher themselves would worry about whether or not to put the heating on tomorrow evening because gas has gone up by, is it 22% this autumn? And God knows what's going to happen in the budget for many people. Many of us who are calling for cuts and pointing out that there's no other way, we really don't have any idea what it's like for people on the breadline and for people who have been pushed over the precipice of despair in many cases. And I think it would be good to reflect on that. In my view, what is happening, what is being proposed in terms of the speed and scale of fiscal adjustment and the hollowing out of what remains of our social welfare provision and social provision more generally is unnecessary, it's immoral, and it's economically damaging. And this needs to be said, and this needs to be contended. In terms of where we're at and where we're going, I thought it would be useful to recall some data. This is a chart of total public expenditure, general government expenditure across the EU states. Ireland is below the EU average in spite of having growing unemployment and recessionary impacts on public expenditure. Some countries are at the top, obviously: Denmark, France, Finland, Belgium, Sweden, and so on. Incidentally, there's no relationship between this and public insolvency. In terms of trends in government expenditure and revenue, let's have a look at Ireland first of all. We have been a low-tax, low-spend economy as a proportion of GDP, and I think it is proper to compare these things with GDP and not GNP, so I might disagree with you there, Tom, on that point. There isn't time to develop that point, but anyway, this is also the way the Troika does it anyway. All the stability program update comparisons and Maastricht criteria are done in terms of GDP. So, sure, look, we have to do it this way anyway because they're telling us to do it this way, so we better do it this way. But you will know that the country went mad in 2010 with expenditure. This was really an extraordinary time when the equivalent of 20% of GDP was put onto the general government deficit, courtesy of Anglo-Irish and INBS device, of course. The way this is actually going to be paid off in the future is through interest payments and also through those infamous Anglo-Irish promissory notes, which appear on an obscure line under exchequer expenditure, but not under general government deficit, because it has already been accounted for in 2010. The thing to notice about this is that to the right of the line, from 2008 onwards, based exactly on the data provided by the Department of Finance in their Stability Programme update, the last one being April, the plan is to hold revenue as a proportion of GDP at around 35% and to reduce public expenditure from its current level of 46.5% when you exclude the bank recapitalisation down to 40%. So the trick is to close the deficit by cutting expenditure as a proportion of GDP and keeping revenue more or less as a constant proportion of GDP. This is predicated, by the way, on the assumption of economic growth, which is an assumption that may be revised downward, most likely. But I'm just going to keep this simple. I'm just going here with the data that has been provided in the SPU. In terms of revenue, the blue line there shows European average norms of revenue. This is average as between the Nordics, generally speaking on the high side, and the countries that end in IA, Romania, Latvia, and all those ones at the bottom. And of course, we're closer to the bottom, the green line there again. So we are a low tax and therefore a low spend economy. The point of this really is that the whole adjustment is in terms of a smaller state as a proportion of GDP, and the adjustment falling very much now, of course, in the immediate period ahead on non-pay expenditure. I find it difficult to see or understand what can be left to cut on non-pay expenditure, actually, when you work through the details. And we should know more in terms of the comprehensive expenditure review in a few weeks' time. Okay, I just wanted to move on quickly and to say that, conscious of the time as well, that there is a lot of work to be done in terms of providing a credible alternative to this. And one of the things we in the Economic Research Unit plan to do is to bring together the macroeconomic debate data so that we can enter into this discussion and debate. If you followed the recent work of the ESRI and the Independent Fiscal Advisory Council, you will see that the assumptions and effectively the multipliers underlying those figures are not really publicly available or certainly not open to ready access and debate. And that's something that needs to change. We need to put all the information on the table and to see what alternative options there are. Just to close, I think it's important that we reflect on the positives here, and I think perhaps the two biggest positives going into the future is our people and our natural resources. And the crisis in the financial system ultimately reflects the crisis in the real economy globally as well as nationally. If we allow a waste of 15% unemployment over the coming years, and particularly underemployment, which is much bigger than 15% if you include the measures of the CSO to reflect discouraged workers and other categories of underemployment, you're looking at 25%. If you focus on young people under 25 years of age, the rates of unemployment are much higher. If you focus on unskilled early school leavers, you find that 50% of boys are either out of work or out of the labour force. That's between the ages of 18 and 24. In the case of girls, half of them are similarly out of any economic activity. And that really is quite ominous, because that generation, I think, is much less likely to emigrate, it strikes me, and there are real issues there in terms of integrating and training and bringing people into society and into economic activity. I'll just close on one reflection. We were talking about words in German this morning. I'm not an expert in German or Greek, but the Greek word, I don't know if a colleague from Greece was here earlier advising me how to pronounce this word, krinen, I think it's actually ancient Greek. It's the root word for crisis, and apparently it means to judge, separate, and decide. And in fact, that's really what we're being called on to do in terms of political economy, to judge the situation at large, to separate the different elements, and to make decisions about what economy do we envisage in what kind of society in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, and in 20 years' time. I don't really hear this debate at the moment. All I'm hearing is how we're going to get to 8.6% deficit next year, and if it slips to 8.8%, we'll do a little bit more cutting so that we'll get to 8.6, but we're not discussing the pathway to a more equal and a more sustainable and a fairer society. And finally, we need to act, because to analyse is not enough. Thank you.